He walked into the room, and the air seemed to freeze mid-breath, as though every soul inside had been caught in the grip of an invisible hand. At first glance, he looked like nothing more than a drifter. His jeans torn and frayed at the knees, his jacket stained with dirt and years of wear, his shoes scuffed to the bone. The scent of rain and city grit clung to him, harsh and unmistakable. No one would have guessed that behind the grime and rags stood Michael Harrington, a man whose name alone carried weight, whose fortune built a restaurant empire stretching from New York to Los Angeles, whose reputation for ruthless discipline had made even seasoned executives tremble. For years, his employees had smiled at him with perfect teeth, polished their voices until they dripped with honey, and bowed with rehearsed grace whenever he passed. They spoke of loyalty, of admiration, of respect. But deep in his gut, Michael wondered if any of it was real. Were those smiles born of genuine gratitude? Or were they masks, painted on out of fear of losing their place beneath his empire's gilded roof? It was a question no boardroom could answer, no quarterly report could measure, no check could buy. And so, he decided to do the unthinkable. He stripped himself of every symbol of power. No tailored suits from Savile Row, no gleaming Rolex that ticked louder than silence. No chauffeur opening doors, no credit card that could silence suspicion with a single swipe. Tonight, he carried nothing but his hunger, his anonymity, and a plan. Tonight, Michael Harrington would be no one, a nameless wanderer in the very halls he had built, not to test their skills, but their humanity. The room into which he stepped was a theater of elegance. Chandeliers hung like constellations of fire above the guests, scattering light across the crystal glasses filled with amber wine. Silver cutlery gleamed with surgical precision beside porcelain plates, and the polished marble floor reflected every shimmer, every whisper, every glance. Beauty lived here, but beauty could also wound. The moment Michael crossed the threshold, the performance began. Forks paused midair. Conversations faltered into whispers. The glittering crowd, so effortless in their charm moments before, now shifted with unease. Eyes darted toward him, then away, like blades cutting and retreating, sharp enough to leave marks he could feel on his skin. To them, he was not a man. He was dirt, an intruder, a crack in the flawless surface of their world, and that was precisely what he wanted. In that silence, in those stares, Michael Harrington was no longer their master, their feared employer, their untouchable millionaire. He was stripped bare. He was invisible and yet more exposed than he had ever been. For the first time in years, he wasn't Michael Harrington, the empire. He was simply Michael, a man standing in judgment of the people who once bowed to him, waiting to see if beneath their smiles there was still a shred of truth. Michael Harrington didn't just put on a disguise, he erased himself, the man who once carried himself like a king, whose very wardrobe was a declaration of status, deliberately stripped that away piece by piece. Gone were the crisp tuxedos that shimmered under chandeliers, the ties that cost more than some people's monthly rent, the gleaming leather shoes that once announced his presence before he even spoke. In their place, he chose ruin. He slid into a pair of ripped jeans that clung to him with the smell of mildew, a jacket so shredded and weather-beaten it seemed to carry its scars of battles never fought, and a cap so worn its threads dangled like the final strands of a forgotten life. Then came the final touch, a handful of ash. He smeared it across his face, grinding it into the shallow lines of his cheeks until the mirror reflected not fatigue, but defeat. What looked back at him wasn't a man of power, wealth, or legacy. It was a stranger the world had no reason to notice, a stranger no one wanted to know. When he finally stepped out into the night, the world rejected him without a word. The sidewalks that once welcomed his confident stride suddenly felt like hostile terrain. Strangers glanced at him with wary eyes, only to look away just as quickly, as if his presence carried a disease they might catch. Their avoidance cut deeper than open hostility. It made him invisible. His chest tightened, not because he was truly destitute, but because for the first time, he could taste what invisibility felt like. The bitter flavor of being unseen, unwanted, disposable. And then came the trial that mattered most, his own kingdom. At the end of the street, rising like a monument to his ambition, stood the crown jewel of his empire, the flagship restaurant of the Harrington chain. Its facade glowed with wealth and reputation, a place where the rich arrived to be seen and the powerful came to prove they belonged. Inside, crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls, scattering fragments of light across marble floors polished to a merciless shine. Tables draped in linen stood like islands of order, each set with silver cutlery that gleamed like swords and glasses that sparkled as though they'd been kissed by starlight. Candles flickered delicately, each flame a tiny symbol of curated perfection. Michael pushed open the heavy glass door, and the atmosphere fractured. The familiar scent of roasted truffles, aged Bordeaux, and ambition filled his lungs. Soft classical music threaded through the air, weaving between the chatter of guests adorned in designer suits and shimmering gowns. But when his silhouette crossed the threshold, everything shifted. Forks froze mid-air. Conversations faltered and then collapsed into silence. Dozens of polished heads turned toward him, their eyes heavy with judgment. The chill was immediate. The maitre d', usually the embodiment of effortless charm, stiffened like a soldier at the sight of an intruder. For a fleeting second, irritation flickered across his face before he forced it into a brittle smile. Guests ducked behind menus, pretending to be busy, though the corners of their mouths betrayed smirks of disgust. A couple near the bar leaned closer to one another as though shielding themselves from the contagion of his presence. Michael moved deeper inside. Every step he took struck the marble floor like a hammer, echoing louder than the violins, louder than the whispers rising in his wake. He could feel their stares burning through him, branding him not as a man but as a disruption, an error, an ugly stain on their carefully curated evening. The chandeliers still shimmered, but to him they no longer glowed with luxury. They glared like interrogators, exposing every ragged edge of his disguise. The marble floors mocked him, reflecting not prestige but the scuffed reality of the man he had chosen to become for this night. Yet, beneath the humiliation, something unexpected rose in him, clarity. For the first time in years, he was seeing the truth stripped bare, without the armor of his name, without the power of his fortune. He was just another man. And the world's judgment was merciless, cold, indifferent, disposable. His employees had always bowed, smiled, obeyed. They had treated him like royalty. But now he would see who they truly were. Would they recognize humanity beneath the rags? Would they still serve him, still smile, still extend kindness to someone who appeared to have nothing left to give? Or would they follow the lead of the guests, reducing him to dirt beneath their polished shoes? He found an empty table and lowered himself into the chair. No one hurried to greet him. No one offered a menu, or even a glass of water. The golden glow of the chandeliers bathed every other guest in warmth, but for him it only intensified the isolation, magnifying the disguise until even he almost believed in it. And that, he realized, with a mixture of pain and resolve, was exactly the point. The first reaction wasn't loud. It wasn't the crash of a wine glass or the shriek of an insult hurled across the room. It was quieter than that, subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. A wrinkle of a nose, a twitch at the corner of a painted mouth, the faint hiss of disgust caught between teeth and the rim of a crystal goblet. It didn't need words. The judgment carried itself in the tiniest movements, in those invisible shifts of posture that said, "You don't belong here." Michael Harrington hadn't even reached the center of the room when he felt it. The shift was almost physical, like the sudden drop in air pressure before a storm. One moment, the grand dining hall was buzzing with polite chatter, silverware clinking like delicate bells, waiters gliding between tables with effortless choreography. The chandeliers sparkled above, casting fractured diamonds of light across the marble floor. But as Michael entered, all of that brightness seemed to sour, as though the air itself whistled. At one table, a woman draped in a diamond necklace stiffened. Her jeweled fingers tightened around her champagne flute as she leaned into her husband's ear. Her whisper was sharp enough to slice through the din, though her words were masked beneath the murmur of voices. Her expression, however, said everything. Michael's presence was an offense, an insult carved across her carefully curated evening. At another table, a man in a silk tie shifted in his chair, sliding closer to the wall as though proximity itself might contaminate him. He kept his gaze locked anywhere but on Michael, studying the ceiling, the linen, even his own fingernails. Anything to avoid eye contact, as though looking at the man would soil him. The music of conversation faltered. What had been effortless sophistication only seconds before cracked into jagged silence, a silence that cut far deeper than any shout. Then slowly, voices restarted, but softer now, sharper, sharpened by venom. Words slipped like knives into the air, slicing Michael where he stood. What's he doing here? This is supposed to be exclusive. God, he stinks. Each comment struck like a lash, invisible but merciless. Every step Michael took dragged the room further into its own hypocrisy. The chandelier still glittered, the linens remained white, the marble gleamed as if untouched by time, but the illusion was gone. The veneer of refinement, of class and culture, had been stripped bare. To them, Michael wasn't a man. He wasn't even an intruder. He was contamination, something less than human. And then came the staff, Victoria Brown, the senior waitress. Saw him first. She had been here long enough to believe she was the hall itself, its enforcer, its silent judge. Her uniform was immaculate, black vest pressed so sharp it could cut, apron strings tied with the precision of shackles. Even her hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull the softness out of her face. When her eyes landed on Michael, she froze. For half a heartbeat, her lips pressed into a line. Then they curved into something crueler, a smirk. The kind of smirk you'd see when someone found a cockroach crawling across a wedding cake. She didn't need to say much. A flick of her chin toward Michael, a glance exchanged with another server, and the ripple began. Quiet laughter spilled across the floor, muffled but unmistakable. Looks like someone lost his way to the shelter, she muttered. Just loud enough for her colleagues to hear, just quiet enough to deny if questioned. One waiter pinched his nose with exaggerated disgust. Another snickered, hiding his grin behind a tray of crystal glasses. The cruelty wasn't loud or dramatic. It was worse. It was casual, polished, rehearsed, like something they had done before. Michael wasn't a customer to them. He wasn't a man in need. He was an inconvenience, a blemish they'd laugh about until it went away. He found a table in the corner, a small, lopsided thing shoved against the wall like an afterthought. The chair wobbled beneath him, creaking as if even the furniture resisted his weight. No menus appeared. No server approached with water. He sat surrounded by staff, yet somehow cut off completely, as though an invisible glass barrier had dropped around him. He felt the line, unspoken, invisible, absolute, that marked who belonged here and who did not. But then something shifted. A pair of eyes lingered. Sophie Miller saw him. She was new, barely a few weeks into the job, and still carried that nervous energy of someone desperate to prove she belonged among polished Itonan chandeliers. Unlike Victoria Picot, her uniform didn't sit on her like armor. On Sophie, it looked borrowed, like a costume she hadn't quite grown into. But Sophie didn't see what everyone else saw. She didn't focus on the dirt smudging Michael's jacket or the ash across his face. She saw the hunger, the way his eyes tracked a steaming bowl of soup as it glided past, the way his lips tightened with restraint, as though swallowing not food but dignity, the way his shoulders sagged under a weight nobody else wanted to acknowledge. Her chest tightened. She knew the rules here: perfection only, elegance only, wealth only. She knew the whispers that followed new hires down the back corridors. Serve fast. Smile thinly. Don't make mistakes. Above all, never acknowledge the people who don't belong. But rules meant nothing when a man sat before her with eyes that screamed despair. Sophie inhaled. The cruelty in the room pressed against her like a tidal wave, daring her to stay still, to conform. But she moved anyway. She stepped forward. Her shoes clicked against the marble floor, each sound a tiny act of defiance, a drumbeat against the suffocating silence. Victoria's smirk shattered. Her eyes narrowed into daggers. "Don't you dare," she hissed, low and sharp as Sophie passed. But Sophie didn't stop. She walked straight to Michael's table. For one suspended moment, the entire room froze. Guests peeked over their menus. Servers paused mid-stride. A glass clinked too loudly, echoing like a gunshot. Sophie set her hand gently on the back of Michael's chair, leaning just close enough that her words would belong only to him. "Sir," she whispered, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart, "you deserve to eat here, just like anyone else." Michael's head lifted slowly. Behind layers of grime and humiliation, his eyes glistened, catching the light of the chandeliers. The mask of isolation cracked, just slightly, enough for gratitude to seep through. He didn't speak, couldn't, but the thank you was there, raw and undeniable. Sophie straightened, her shoulders firmer now. In that instant, her decision was carved in stone. No laughter, no ridicule, no unspoken policy could stop her. She would serve him. She would make sure he ate. And in that fragile moment, Michael realized something extraordinary. Amid the venom, amid the cold performance of wealth and superiority, compassion still lived. It was fragile, flickering, almost invisible. But it was real. And Sophie Miller, the youngest, the newest, the most uncertain of them all, had just risked everything to prove it. The moment Sophie opened her mouth, the atmosphere cracked like glass under pressure. "Sir?" she said, her voice steady. "You are a guest here, and you deserve respect." Every syllable landed like a challenge hurled at the entire room. Guests shifted in their chairs, stunned that someone dared break the unspoken law of exclusivity. The staff froze, their smirks evaporating. But Victoria Brown, arms crossed, eyes blazing, stepped forward like a queen defending her throne. "You can't be serious, Sophie," Victoria sneered. This man doesn't belong here. Do you want to ruin our reputation? Do you want to embarrass us in front of everyone?" Sophie's heart pounded so loudly she could hear it over the soft piano music that now felt like mockery. But she refused to back down. "Our reputation, Ufash," she fired back, "means nothing if we forget that every human being deserves dignity. Every single one." Gasps fluttered across the tables. Victoria's cheeks flushed crimson, her lips curling into a sharp grin. "You're naive. You'll learn this business isn't about feelings. It's about image. And she jabbed a finger toward Michael, "destroys the image." Michael sat motionless, his disguise perfect. But inside he was watching with a fierce intensity. For the first time in years, he wasn't the boss. He was the test. And Sophie was the answer. She turned away from Victoria and marched straight to the kitchen doors. The scent of garlic and butter grew stronger with every step. Chefs shouted orders, pans clattered, knives struck cutting boards in a rhythm of controlled chaos. And at the center of it all stood Chef Daniel Rossi, tall, imposing, his apron streaked with flour and fire, a man who treated food like sacred art. "Chef Rossi," Sophie called out, her voice cutting through the storm. Daniel turned, his brow furrowed. "Miller, What are you doing back here? You're supposed to be on the floor." "There's a man in the dining hall," she said, her chest heaving with urgency. "He's hungry, he's being mocked, he's being treated like garbage, and I won't let it happen." The kitchen fell silent. Even the boiling pot seemed to hush, as though waiting for his reply. Rossi narrowed his eyes. "That's not our problem. We don't feed vagrants here. The Harrington name is built on prestige, Miles, not charity." Sophie stepped closer, trembling but unbroken. "Then what is prestige worth if we trample human dignity? If we serve caviar to the rich and turn our backs on a man who's starving just a few feet away? Tell me, chef, what does that make us?" Daniel's jaw tightened. His hands flexed against the countertop, torn between tradition and truth. Around him, young line cook stared wide-eyed, watching this waitress stand toe-to-toe with the most feared man in the kitchen. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Sophie whispered, almost pleading, "Please, if we claim to serve excellence, let it start with compassion." Something shifted in Daniel Rossi's gaze. The fire softened. The steel cracked. He glanced at the waiting staff, peeking nervously through the swinging doors, then back at Sophie. Finally, he exhaled. "Fine, Phil," he growled. "But if I do this, it'll be done right." He grabbed a pan quechua, slammed it onto the burner, and barked orders with thunderous precision. Garlic hit the oil, sizzling into perfume. Herbs danced in the pan, wine hissed against flame. Daniel moved like a conductor leading an orchestra, crafting not a meal of pity, but a dish worthy of royalty. Minutes later, he slid a steaming plate onto the pass, golden-crusted chicken glazed in wine reduction, a side of roasted vegetables gleaming like jewels, and a small bowl of fresh soup, still releasing ribbons of steam. He looked at Sophie, his voice low but firm. "Take it to him, and don't let anyone stop you." Sophie nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She lifted the tray, her arms trembling not from its weight, but from the enormity of the moment. When she walked back into the dining hall, silence rippled through the room. The tray gleamed under the chandeliers. Every guest turned. Every server froze. Victoria's jaw dropped. Her face contorted in outrage. But Sophie didn't falter. She carried the plate like a banner of defiance, like proof that compassion still had a place in this palace of marble and crystal. She set it gently in front of Michael, bowing her head as though serving not a stranger, but a king. And in that moment, Michael Harrington felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The rumor didn't just spread, it detonated. Like sparks catching dry timber, it raced from table to table, whispered behind napkins, carried on nervous glances until it reached the ears of Isabella Torres, the manager of the establishment. Within minutes, her office door flew open. She stormed out, every step of her stiletto heels slicing against the polished marble like the crack of a whip. Her presence alone was enough to drain the room of conversation. She carried authority so sharp that silence seemed to arrive before she even uttered a word. The dining hall froze in collective suspension. Forks hovered in midair, trembling just above porcelain plates. Crystal glasses quivered in hesitant hands. The background piano, once lively, had long since dwindled into silence, as though even the music had chosen to retreat from the tension. And there, at the very epicenter of this storm of wealth, judgment, and whispers, sat Michael Harrington, disguised in worn clothes that barely masked his true identity. He hunched quietly over the simple plate Sophie had placed before him. He didn't rush, didn't gulp his food with desperation. Instead, he ate slowly, almost reverently, as though every bite carried weight, memory, and dignity. In that moment, the scrape of his fork seemed louder than the grand chandeliers swaying overhead. Isabella's sharp eyes narrowed, locking onto the scene. "What is going on here?" she demanded, her voice slicing the air with authority. A ripple of unease ran through the staff. Waiters shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze, afraid of being the target of her wrath. Then, stepping forward with a grin that curled into triumph, came Victoria Brown. Her lips were sharp, her words sharper. "That man doesn't belong here, she announced, her voice coated in disdain. "He's ruining everything. He's embarrassing us in front of the guests." Her accusation spread like poison. Guests, clad in tailored suits and glittering jewelry, nodded in agreement, whispering in low, venomous tones. The air thickened, heavy with judgment. The fragile boundary between luxury and humanity carved deeper with every glance of contempt. Before Isabella could respond, another voice shattered the poisonous atmosphere, Sophie's, clear, unwavering, and startlingly brave. "He's a human being, and he's hungry. That's all that matters." A gasp rippled through the hall. A young waitress, Mimo Aiko Webster, barely older than some of the guests' children, had dared to speak out, not against a colleague, not against a peer, but against her manager and the unspoken code of the wealthy elite. Isabella's face hardened. Her jaw clenched, but in her eyes flickered something she rarely allowed: hesitation. For a fleeting second, doubt touched her. The fragile pause broke violently when Victoria snapped. Losing control of her carefully maintained composure, she seized her plate with trembling hands and hurled it against the floor. The porcelain exploded into shards, sauce splattering across the pristine marble like blood at a crime scene. The crash echoed, louder than thunder, silencing even the gasps that followed. Chandeliers above seemed to flicker in protest at the violence unleashed beneath them. "This is madness," Victoria shrieked, her voice cracking with fury. "We are not a soup kitchen. If we let people like him sit here, this place becomes nothing." The words slashed through the hall like knives. Guests recoiled, their faces twisting not just in shock, but in recognition of their own unspoken prejudices. It was as if Victoria had ripped the veil from their civility, exposing the raw ugliness that lay beneath the glitter and gold. Michael's shoulders sank. The shame was suffocating, pressing down on him, ready to crush him under the weight of their rejection. But before despair could swallow him whole, Sophie moved. She stepped forward, her frame small compared to the towering presence of the chandeliers, yet unshakable in her defiance. Planting herself between Michael and the judgmental stares, she spread her arms wide, a human shield made not of power, but of courage. Her eyes blazed as she faced them all. "Enough," she cried, her voice breaking with emotion but never faltering. "This man will not be humiliated. Not here. Not tonight." The words cut through the hall like a sword of light. Silence crashed down, heavier than stone. Guests froze, caught between the weight of their own cruelty and the undeniable bravery of the young waitress who had just defied them all. Even Isabella, a woman who had weathered storms of scandal and power struggles, faltered. For once, she had no script, no authority to hide behind. From behind Sophie's protective stance, Michael looked up. His eyes, weary yet burning, met hers. They carried sorrow, yes, but also awe. Awe for this woman who didn't know the truth. She had no idea that the man she defended was, in fact, the silent owner of every gilded surface around them. But in that instant, none of that mattered. What mattered was the act itself, that Sophie Miller had done what chandeliers, marble floors, and gold-embossed menus could never do. She had returned humanity to the room. The next morning, the dining hall felt like a courtroom awaiting judgment. The staff stood in stiff rows, whispering nervously, replaying the chaos from the night before. Plates had shattered, voices had risen, reputations had cracked. No one knew what punishment would fall, but every heart beat with dread. Then the doors opened. Michael Harrington stepped inside. Gone were the rags, the ash, the disguise. In their place, A tailored charcoal suit, polished shoes that clicked against the marble, and a presence so commanding it silenced the room instantly. His shoulders carried authority. His gaze cut sharper than any blade. Gasps erupted. Someone dropped a tray. Victoria Brown's face drained of color, her mouth opening but no words coming out. Sophie Miller's eyes widened. Her breath caught in her throat, because standing before them was the truth. The homeless intruder from last night was no intruder at all. He was their employer, their millionaire, their king. Michael let the silence stretch until the weight of it pressed against every chest. Then he spoke. "Last night," he said, his voice echoing through the hall, "you revealed who you truly are." No one dared move, Pio. No one dared blink. "I walked in wearing nothing but rags," he continued. "And the guests turned away. The staff mocked me. Some of you saw a man and stripped him of dignity. Some of you saw a human being and chose compassion." His eyes swept across the faces. Victoria trembled, her chin lowered in shame. The maitre d' stared at the floor. Others shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his gaze as though the truth itself burned. But then Michael stopped. His gaze landed on Sophie. His expression softened, the steel in his voice melting for the first time. "And one of you," he said, "had the courage to stand against the crowd." Sophie felt tears sting her eyes, but she held his gaze. The entire staff turned to look at her, whispers rippling like waves. Michael stepped closer, Skia, his voice firm. "Sophie Miller, you reminded me, and everyone in this room, of what true service means. Not service to money, not service to image, Skia. Service to humanity." He paused, letting the words carve into the air like scripture. This was never about food. This was about heart. And Sophie showed me that compassion still lives in these walls. He turned back to the group, his tone sharpening again. "Let this be a lesson. Crystal chandeliers and marble floors mean nothing if kindness is absent. Luxury is hollow without humanity." A heavy silence fell. Victoria's head hung low, shame rolling off her like a storm cloud. Sophie, trembling, stood taller than ever. Michael straightened, his authority undeniable. "From this day forward, Sophie Miller will be my assistant, because I trust her with something greater than service. I trust her with the soul of this place." Gasps filled the hall again, but this time they weren't of scorn. They were of awe. Michael turned to leave, his suit catching the morning light, his words lingering like thunder. And in that silence, every person in the room understood. Last night wasn't a disaster, it was a revelation. Before the entire staff, Sophie Miller was praised and named Michael's personal assistant. Victoria Brown bowed her head, drowning in shame. The lesson rang louder than chandeliers. True luxury isn't crystal or marble. It is compassion. It is the courage to honor every human being's dignity. Michael Harrington's shocking test proved one truth. Wealth means nothing without compassion. Sophie Miller's courage changed everything. If this story moved you, hit like, share it with friends, and subscribe for more powerful stories that reveal the hidden lessons of everyday life. Don't miss what's coming next.